Dr. Melby is, in my opinion, a very eminent person in his field, and he's doing tremendous things. Dr. Melby was at one time dean in New York University, and now he's in Michigan and seemingly all over the country. Yesterday we went to get him, and it was I thought, rather humorous. At first I thought that I might not be able to go, and Everett said, well, how would I recognize Dr. Melby? And I said, look for a tall, distinguished gentleman with a twinkle in his eye. And with that, I'll introduce you to Dr. Melby.
That's one of the best introductions I've had in a long time. I'm very glad to have a chance to be here on the first day of this wonderful workshop with my good friends here, John Pohl and Helen Sorensen and others. I really, incidentally, Ball State is, and I was going to say, old and friendly place to me, because my acquaintance here goes back to President Pittenger and Mr. Neuer and others. So you see, and Jack Emmons, the present president, is an old friend from my Northwestern days. And so this always, I always feel, is to me a very friendly place to come. I, of course, looked over the material that Mr. Pohl gave me. There's something of the places where all of you people come from, and something said about the purpose of this workshop. And perhaps it might, since I have had a little introduction to you, I might take about a minute and say just a little bit about the experiences that have led me to the points of view that I'll try to express to you in the next few minutes, because I'm going to say some things that perhaps will shock some of you, and you might reject the whole business, but I want you to know at least that the things I'm saying are based on experience and not on just irritation or sudden Johnny-come-lately discovery of something, although there is an element of this in it. I spent the first 15 years of my teaching experience in the public schools as a school superintendent, and since I was interested in the elementary school, I did a great deal of work with children and learned, I thought, something about learning and about teaching, and I have had all my life a keen interest in teaching and in teachers. But there followed then a period of university work, which in a sense came to an end with my retirement at New York University in 1956. I then came to Michigan, and since I was a retired professor, so to speak, was now rid of all sorts of administrative assignments and worries, I was free to go back into schools and get a sort of a refresher course in the problems of the big city. And very early in my going to Michigan State, I began going to Flint and some to Detroit. And even though I had lived for 13 years in Chicago and for 11 years in New York, I have to say that I was really surprised and baffled and not a little bit ashamed of myself that somehow or other I could have lived all these years and talked about education as much as I did, and writing some about it and doing many things, and not being more realistic than I was. And I suppose that it says something about deans and presidents and so on, that perhaps none of us are very realistic. We are fishing with a long pole, and the pole is so long we can't even tell when we have a fish on, let alone when we have bait on. I think we insulate ourselves on a university campus, and we are so far removed from reality. And when I really began to dig in, oh, don't get me wrong, I was taken through Harlem early in my New York experience with a police guard. I saw all these things. I went out, took my students out to see them and all this kind of thing. But it wasn't until I really began to stay around schools in the morning and in the afternoon and in the evening until 10, 11 o'clock at night, until I began to work with the parents and to interview the kids and all this kind of thing, that I really began to see that something had happened that I somehow had not really. I had heard people, and of course read the statistics and read the books and all, but it still has somehow hadn't quite come alive to me. And I guess that when people began to talk about poverty, I guess I thought I was an authority on poverty because I had surely been poor enough as a child. And I'm sure that the poverty from which I came was, in an economic way, much deeper than the poverty that people experience today in the slums. But there is a dimension to the modern slum, to the inner core of the city, that the frontier poverty didn't have, and that's the dimension of alienation. We weren't alienated. I had good parents. There was plenty of affection in our family. We didn't feel rejected. I at no time in my life felt other than I think as a child and a youth, other than a hopeful outlook on life. And so did the youngsters with whom I went to school. The frontier was essentially a hopeful place. If the crop was bad this year, it would be better next year, and so on. And when I spent 4 years in Montana, they told me that the Montana farmers were the best next year farmers in the world. I think this was true. We were all pretty good next year farmers, and the hopes never left us. And one of my first really real shocks was to spend a couple of weeks some years ago interviewing dropouts and potential dropouts. And even though I had been a high school teacher and had a lot of experience with young people, I had never before talked to boys and girls with these kinds of attitudes. And I've discovered that I could interview a dozen youngsters in a day and another dozen tomorrow, and that there would not be one hopeful note in a week's experience. These youngsters have no hope. They have no faith. They don't like anybody, and nobody likes them, and they feel completely rejected. I remember one boy so well because we had such a long and revealing conversation, and finally I said to him, well, what do you do? He said, I walk. I said, you mean you walk looking for a job? He said, oh, I'll never get a job. I've tried in hundreds of places. And I said, still, you walk? I didn't quite get the point. He said, you have to do something. You can't sit there. So he said, I walk all day. Where do you go? Oh, any place. I just walk. And when he walks, of course, he sees you and me and others riding around in our nice automobiles like Helen Sorensen here, you know. I had a chance to ride in that nice wagon last night, and he sees us living in our nice houses, and he sees men carrying dinner pails and going to jobs and chatting amiably, and he sees the rest of the world that somehow or other belongs, somehow or other these people are all part of something that he doesn't quite understand, He's on the outside and he's looking in, but he finds no one who wants him. Nobody cares. And if it happens that he happens to be Negro or Mexican or Puerto Rican or something which sort of sets him apart and perhaps causes him to be discriminated against, then his situation is doubly serious. And I came out of this experience realizing something about education that I don't think the reading of any number of books would have told me. One of them, and in a way sometimes I'm sort of sorry that I had the experience, because I think life would be an awful lot simpler if I hadn't. One thing, for instance, I could listen to speeches at conventions with much more less stress and strain than I now. I'm getting to where I can't hardly, and you know, if you make a lot of speeches the way I do, you have one penalty is you have to listen to other people's speeches. And another thing, I go to Flint 3 days a week, have all this year, except while I was absent in Florida. And I drive over there in the morning, leaving my house about 7 o'clock and returning at various times in the afternoon. But sometimes if there is no activity in the afternoon, I get back to my office at Michigan State around 3 o'clock, and it's still time to go up to the coffee room and have a cup of coffee with faculty members. And there I find a dozen faculty members sitting in a circle, and they're chewing the fat about educational problems. And I, fresh from my experience in Flint, I am listening to these people talk about teacher education. And sometimes I think I should pinch myself to see if I'm really alive. Is this are people actually saying these things? And they are assuming a world that is non-existent as far as the inner core of our big cities is concerned. And I have to say that I am afraid that American teacher education as a whole, there are spots of difference, but I am afraid that possibly 3/4 of it, maybe even more, is totally unrealistic as far as the realities of our modern, industrial, automated, urbanized society is concerned. And I've had the experience, for instance, of trying to get my colleagues on the university faculties just to drive 50 miles over to Flint and take a look under a little guidance at some of the problems just there in the city of Flint. And now I should point out that Flint is a city of only a couple of 100,000, and it is not Detroit, and it's not New York, and it's not Chicago. But it has the problems of these cities, well, more than in microcosm, but it is perhaps a manageable situation. I don't think New York City, as now organized, is manageable, and I doubt that Detroit is manageable. And when it gets to, and I can talk about this because it was in the press, one of our most outstanding principals in Detroit resigned the other day and said he couldn't do anything anymore because of the bureaucracy and the controls from the central office. And I suspect that there are dozens of these all over the United States in our big cities. And while I'm not here to talk about administration, I think I might set some of you who are interested in administration to thinking a little bit about this, that I don't think our educational system will survive under the present concepts of administration. I think they're completely outdated and rendered obsolete by the conditions of modern society. But that's a big, long story, and I don't think I want to get into that right now. But that's what I think about it, that I think we're going to have to develop an entirely different concept, because I think the one we have just is completely out of gear with modern life. Of course, one of our great troubles is that human beings, I think, have always done this, and it's worse now because the speed of social change. But one of the greatest human errors is to do one's thinking in the context of conditions which are no longer existent. This has been the trouble of conservatives and reactionaries throughout all history, that they would not face reality. And I think perhaps more than anything else, the conservatives are the people who refuse to face reality. They think that the world is the same as it was before the early 40s, when they put on that controlled reaction under the stadium at the University of Chicago, because in that moment a new world was born and the old world is dead, and we have to face an entirely different kind of situation. And it's this refusal on our part to face the new world which causes us so much difficulty. Now, one of the things, but I'm taking too much time here, one of the things that began to come to me very sharply as I worked with these youngsters was that the educational system, if I might call it that, which we have, is really not an educational system. It is really a scholastic establishment. And the scholastic establishment has something to sell to the child when he enters school at the age of 6, and it keeps on selling him stuff that it has on the shelf, as long as he is in school, even through the graduate school. And if this youngster is, by upbringing in his home, by background, by cultural experience, ready to begin to partake of this diet at the age of 6 when he starts school, and he has a supportive home and a mother and father who are both there and they love him and they can heal him when he comes home from his bad experiences in school, he somehow survives and he graduates. And we teachers think we have won a victory, and we think we're succeeding, and we cite the number of high school graduates, and Michigan State, where I work, can brag about the number of merit scholars it has, and so on. But we don't say much about the enormous human scrap heap. For example, it is really a terrifying thing in human terms to realize that in Detroit, for example, and the good sister is here from Detroit, and please, I'm not picking on, I'm just citing this as because it's close to me and I happen to know a little bit more about it than I do about some. But in Detroit, out of every 100 children who start at school at 6, only 50 finish high school on time 12 years later. And out of every 100 who start in the 9th grade, only 70 finish 4 years later. Now, I think one can say, and I believe this is an understatement rather than an overstatement, because it doesn't take account of the damage that is done to the children who graduate. You know, Earl Kelly over at Wayne says that we can't even count the dropouts because he says most of the dropouts stay with us. I'm not taking any account of the dropouts that stay with us, but just let's take the dropouts that actually drop out and leave school. This is about 30% of our population in the big cities. Now, a very striking thing becomes apparent when you begin to study the work patterns of the American people. 30 years ago in this country, 1 out of every 4 of the people in the workforce worked at an unskilled job. Now just get that in your mind. 1 out of 4. 1 in every 4 was an unskilled worker. Today it's 1 in 20. Now this is a staggering change, and nothing like this in the work habits of the people. No change like this has ever taken place in human history before. It's an almost unbelievable thing that in 30 short years you could reduce the number of unskilled workers from 1 in 4 to 1 in 20. So what really is happening today is that for every unskilled job that there is in our society, there are about 5, or maybe even a little more, high school dropouts theoretically lining up to get that one job. So we fail to graduate from high school 5 or 6 times as many people as are needed to fill the unskilled positions in our economy. So you can see what really is happening. And of course, it doesn't take very long looking at this problem before you begin to see that our profession has never even worked for total success. We work only for limited success. We have always held that school was not for everybody, that there were some people for whom school isn't for him, we say. And when these youngsters leave us, we have often heaved a sigh of relief that they were gone. And I remember so well in the little rural community where I grew up. Here was a rural school that I knew for a period of about 15 years while I was attending it, going to high school and going to college. And in the entire 15-year period that I knew it, only 3 boys got an 8th grade diploma out of that school. By the grace of God or something, I happened to be one of the 3. But what happened to the rest of them? They dropped out at any grade, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever it might be. They went back on the farm and helped Dad with the farm work, and after a while they married some girl who had similarly dropped out of school, and they raised a good family of kids. They were good citizens. They weren't on relief. They weren't in jail. They weren't delinquents. Oh, they were a little on the crude side and not as sophisticated as you are here, but they were pretty good people. I used to feel terrible about this situation, and I often used to speak of it in my speeches. And I took part in the consolidation movement, you know, where we tried to improve, get rid of these little rural schools, and I used this as a horrible example and all. You know, now I don't feel sorry for them at all. I think they were very lucky. They got out of school before the school ruined them. Because they left school with a good self-image. Dad wanted them at home on the farm, married a nice girl, they proceeded to have a nice family. They grew up in a community where they were looked up to and seen as hard-working, self-respecting people. But today, this isn't the situation. Dad hasn't got any farm to go to in the slums of our city. There isn't any job to go to. And we have created a society that has less and less use for unskilled people and less use for uneducated people. We are on a way to creating a society in which the minimum requirement for even a marginal participation in our prosperity is an education. And we can't afford any failures anymore. Now, of course, I know what I go around talking about this, and I get everywhere I go. I know exactly what goes on in people's minds. They say, well, there's no human enterprise that doesn't have failure, and there'll never be a school system that doesn't have failure. And they say there are some children who are just uneducable, and you can't do anything about it, and nobody can do anything. And anyway, to do what you propose would cost too much money, and it's out of the question. That's the way they talk. In fact, one of my colleagues, a professor the other day, made a speech back east in which he said that it was no use to talk about helping each child to become all he was capable of becoming, because he said no society will ever be able to help every child to become all he's capable of becoming. He said what you've got to do is decide who has the most becoming ahead of him, and then concentrate on him, because you're not going to be able to help all of them. Well, just in human terms and in terms of American democracy, I couldn't buy this. Somehow or other, the thing that has come home to me as I work with these youngsters and with the teachers who work with them, this has something to do with our race problems too. You know, about 3-4 weeks ago, I was down in Louisiana, and it's down at southeastern Louisiana College, and it's down in the swamps of Louisiana. really down not far from, Bogalusa and all these places that you're hearing about. Well, I didn't know quite what was going to happen, but somebody spoke up in the audience and said, now, look, you're talking about the importance of the child's self-image. Aren't you going to destroy the self-image of children if you force Negro and white children to be educated together? And I pointed out that Mr. Schulman, one of our faculty members, who came to us from the University of Chicago, had participated in an experiment where they took about 100 Negro children on the south side of Chicago and moved them across a district line into a white school district, or a largely white school district. And at the beginning, these children were way behind the average of the white children. By the end of 1 year, their achievements on an average were indistinguishable from the rest of the children in the school. Well, anyway, as a result of all of this, I felt there was nothing for me to do but to say what I thought about this, and I think I'm going to do it here, because I don't think, as long as we deal with these problems in a purely scientific and mechanistic fashion of learning certain bodies of subject matter and thinking of certain kinds of curricula and certain methodology and all this kind of thing, I don't think we're going to do anything. But the thing that has come home to me more and more as the years have gone on and I had these experiences is that I have begun to think about how you and I and everyone, how do we become whole men and women? How can I be a whole man? How can you be a whole man? How can you be a whole woman? And not only a part one. The first time I really saw this was when I visited Germany in 1939, when it was under Hitler, and I was about to leave. And one of these Nazis who had been shadowing me all the time I was in Germany came to see that I got safely out of the country. So he asked me how I felt, and I had been there a month, and I said, I'm so happy that I'm going to get out of here this afternoon. They'll get over on the free territory of France. He said, is that because of what we are doing to the Jews? And he said, no. I said, it's because of what you're doing to yourselves. But he didn't understand. Well, I said, you are corroding the German heart. You are destroying the moral strength of the German people, because this discrimination and this persecution is not hurting the Jews as much as it is hurting you. Oddly enough, 10 months to the day, I was back in Germany after the war. And there I saw a people that had, it was a moral vacuum. But a few months afterwards, this was May, I think, and in August I was in Israel. And there I saw the people that the Nazis tried to destroy. And I think that in August of 1949, the Israelis were the strongest people morally on earth. I came on a plane out of Israel and sat next to a young Catholic priest who had been there about the same length of time as I had been, and he turned to me and he said, I think we have just visited the best Christians in the world, and they are Jews. But the point is that the Germans tried to destroy the Jews. They only destroyed themselves. And discrimination, bad as it may be for the person against whom it is vented, is worse for the fellow who does the discriminating. And I think there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that not until all of us receive every human being to our hearts and minds as a brother are we ever whole men and women. And if Christianity has any meaning to me, this is its meaning. And I don't, if this is true in matters of race, surely it is true in matters of economics. Surely it is true in matters of human relations. Surely it is true in educational opportunity and every other facet of our lives. Therefore, I think that if we say in America, and we often do, that we are a Christian nation, that we are a democratic nation, then I think the beginning of our Christianity and our democracy is that we extend to every child, regardless of skin color, regardless of national origin or economic position or any other kind of human condition, that we owe him every opportunity to make the most of himself, to become the best human being that he is capable of becoming. Now, we do this in certain respects, which shows that we sort of recognize this, but we don't go all the way. For instance, if you're blind, if you're deaf, or if you're crippled, I saw out in Kansas last year on a trip to Wichita a young teacher of about 25 years of age, I would guess, who was teaching a little girl, perhaps 6 years old. This little girl was deaf, stone deaf, and of course dumb as a result, because she can't hear her own voice. And she was teaching her to speak, to read lips, and to use her voice even though she can't hear it. I was so fascinated with this. Here was one student, one pupil, one teacher, a one-to-one teacher-pupil ratio. I stood there and watched this for about half an hour because I wondered if I could detect any change in the half hour and I could not. So I stopped afterwards to ask this young girl, can you notice any change from week to week? She said, not much. Can you notice any change from month to month? She said, a little. When will she be able to talk so that the rest of us can understand her? She said, maybe by the time she's 12 years old. You may remember that there was in New York a play called The Miracle Worker. It told the story of the woman who taught Helen Keller, who was born deaf and dumb and blind, and helped her to become an international figure. The play was shown after I left New York, but friends of mine wrote me about having gone to the play, and they said they walked the streets after they came out at night. They couldn't go home because they said we were so moved by what we had seen, and they said we felt we had witnessed the depth of human tragedy, and we had seen a triumph of the human spirit. And they said it was so moving they couldn't go to bed. The teacher can be a miracle worker. But we are not really trying to be the miracle workers in many instances, and there are lots of things that get in our way. One of the things that gets in our way is the characteristics of this scholastic establishment. We think teaching must be measured out to children equally, as if we were measuring out glasses of milk or something like that. One teacher to every 30 children, or 25 children, or 35 children, or whatever it may be. Same for all. When I talked about this at Michigan State the other day, one professor said he would object to spending any more money on the disadvantaged unless we spent the same amount of money on the gifted and all the other children at the same time. He said we owe every child the same amount of teaching. Well, I can't buy this, because children who are learning how to learn may be learning more effectively if left alone than if are trying to intrude. Because after all, each of us has to educate himself. And our big problem is, how can we teach the children how to learn? And if they are learning how to learn, maybe they can even help other children to learn. And this may be one of the prices of being a quick learner, is that you can be of use in helping the learning of others. So this is a really not a very well-founded opinion, I think. And we can learn something here from medicine. Now, if you go to the hospital with a minor ailment, the floor nurses will take care of you, and maybe the doctor comes to see you every other day, or something like that. But if you go there with a really serious ailment, you'll have nurses around the clock, and you'll not only have the doctor, but you'll have consultants of various kinds. And the interesting thing about it is that medicine operates on the assumption that there is no recognition of failure until all means have been exhausted. And the man in the bed may be a pauper, but and while he's alive, you do everything you can to save him. There's another thing about it. If he finally does die, you don't find the doctor coming into the room and cussing out the corpse for dying. You don't find the doctor blaming the corpse. The doctor will rather examine his own behavior and his own acts and see whether he can learn something out of it and take some of the responsibility himself. But we teachers are really very expert at blaming the children for our failures. He doesn't study. He won't work. His mind wanders. His span of attention is too low. We have all kinds of terminology that we can use to describe the child's failure, but very rarely do we call attention to our own failure, if nothing else to our own failure to apply an adequate amount of effort. Then there's another thing about us that I think we have to begin to look at. The American teaching profession seems to me to exhibit a stubborn reluctance to teach the disadvantaged. There is a book called Education and Income, which deals with this problem. It's by Patricia K.O. Sexton, a sociology professor at the New York University. She made a study in a big city and found that the children of the poor get the poorest school buildings, they get the poorest teachers, they get the poorest school buildings because they live in the center of the city where the old wrecks are still standing. They get the poorest teachers because the experienced teachers don't want to teach in these areas, and so teachers are assigned to these places, and when they see where they are, the first thing they do is to apply to be assigned out, so there is a constant procession of teachers coming and going. Now this is in marked contrast to the practice of medicine. In medicine, you become famous or become rich, maybe. You get prestige, you get status by addressing yourself to to help those who need you the most. If you can work on cancer or heart trouble or really deal with, if you have a cold, maybe you'll go to the doctor around the corner. But if you get seriously ill, you go to Rochester, Minnesota, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, or someplace like that, and go to a great clinic. And this is the road to fame, is to address yourself to the people who have the greatest need. But it seems that in education, it works just the opposite. If a teacher shows himself or herself to be a real good teacher in the public schools, we'll make that person into a principal. Then he doesn't do any teaching anymore. Or we'll send him on to graduate school and become a professor in the university. And if he gets to be a real good professor in the university, we won't even let him teach in the university. We'll make a research worker out of him. So we are, as far as I know, the only profession in which progress means escape from the thing you set out to do in the beginning. If medicine operated the way we do, we'd go down to Texas, where we have this famous man, DeBakey, and I suppose long ago we would have made him manager of the hospital, you know, because he showed himself to be a great surgeon. But we don't do that. He goes on operating as long as he lives. But we somehow have developed a worship for administration. From long experience in New York, I know how the teachers in New York just reach for straws of administrative recognition. You never saw such an administration-hungry group of people in your life. Even the chairmanship of a committee looks like a great release from slavery or something. The doctor is proud of his skill, but the teacher is proud of his achievement of a situation in which skill is no longer needed. Now, I think we better think about this one a little bit. And let me tell you a concrete example that I worked with myself in Flint. We, one year, had some money from the Mott Foundation with which we could reduce the teacher-pupil ratio from 30 to 1, or 1 to 30 to 1 to 15. And we wanted 40 teachers out of the Flint school system, and we wanted the 40 of the best ones we could get. And there was advertised and everything, and there was a great opportunity for experimentation and the like. Instead of getting 40, we got 3, and they weren't very good. We had to recruit, we had to run the whole program with beginners who came in from the outside, some who were teaching for the first time in their lives. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to solve this problem without a fundamental change in the attitude of the American teacher. And unless we get this, it isn't going to do any good to send people off to graduate school. You can acquire all the techniques in the world. You can come here this summer and you can learn all kinds of mechanical things. But if you don't go home with a spirit of dedication, if you don't go home with a feeling that these youngsters with whom you deal are part of you, and you are part of them, it isn't going to do you any good. It isn't going to do them any good. And so I'm saying these days that American education has been tested in the slum of the American city, and it has broken down. You know, I work up there in Flint and Lansing where we have these big automobile factories, and one stunt that the engineers use is to take an engine and run it at top speed, run it at a speed fast as it'll go for a while and see what part breaks. And then they'll identify the weakest link. Well, that's the cultural deprivation or educational disadvantage, or I don't know how we should say this. I'm in trouble no matter which one I use. If I speak of the culturally deprived, then the people who I speak of say, well, you're implying that we have no culture, which of course I am not implying at all. I don't know any term that says what I want to say and doesn't get me into trouble with somebody. Lately I've been using educational disadvantage. And maybe there's some other, maybe this is one thing you might talk about here and see if you can come out with some term. But the American school system, and perhaps school systems all over the world, were designed to teach things the children wouldn't learn at home and in the course of their daily lives: reading, arithmetic, writing, and the like. And assuming that the homes and the communities do their job, then our schools were able, in a great proportion of instances, to teach these things. But we've now reached a position where, in our society, where this is no longer adequate. And we need an education that is going to minister to the whole child, to his character development, to his development as a person. And so this takes us to, and by the way, am I running too long?
No, go right ahead.
Well, I'll stop in a little while and let them ask questions. And this raises the question that you could turn around now and ask, would be to say, well, what do we do? How do we face this? We stopped on the way in here this morning to look at some roses out here. And I grow some roses for a little recreation. And to grow roses effectively, you've got to have a climate. And the parts of the climate, you got to have, the roses got to have water. It's got to have sunshine. It's got to have good soil. And if you have sunshine, and if you have good soil, and you apply plenty of water to keep the bugs away, you can have good roses. Well, human beings are the same way. We need a climate too. And if we have a good climate for growth, we can become good people. And the climate for human beings is made up of three things too, and that's security, affection, and freedom. Unfortunately, in the big cities of our country, the security has been pretty badly shaken. People have been uprooted from the rural areas of the South, brought into the complexities of an urban environment, all the hazards that go with that. And a great deal of the affection has been done away with by the large masses of people and the remoteness of human relationship, big schools, big organizations. And the freedom is pretty limited too by race prejudice, growing unemployment, lack of employment opportunity in unskilled trades and the like. So for many people in our society, the three elements of the good climate for human growth and development have been pretty badly damaged. So education has to do something about this. And now when we do, we have to realize that you can't do it all in the schoolhouse. Maybe one of our big faults or shortcomings is that we exaggerate what can be done in a schoolhouse. Schools can do only certain kinds of things, but schools can be a point from which there can be an orchestration of a lot of other people who can do something. I imagine Helen Sorensen has maybe told you about this or will, but there's a wonderful Walt Whitman poem that says this better than any book I ever saw. The title of the poem is "There Was a Child Went Forth." And Whitman goes on to list all the things that the child saw in a day, and all these, he says, the child became. A wonderful thing. And if you haven't read it before, be sure to read it this summer, because it'll remind you of lots of things. And if we're going to do anything about this, we've got to make a frontal attack on this in every way. There's no simple solution for this. We've got to work with the homes. We've got to work with the parents. We've got to work with the community. We've got to improve the community. We've got to work on the housing, the improvement of the housing. We've got to work with the police. We've got to work on through health and recreation and every aspect. Now, this is one of our. I mentioned earlier this morning that in the early days we in professional education depended on a very narrow psychological base, and it's been very hard for us to move out because we have schoolhouse blinders. But it's the whole community that educates. And there's a role in here for church, for community organizations, for parents, and the big problem, the big challenge that comes to us in education in the years ahead is to learn from an administrative point of view and a teaching point of view how to orchestrate all of this, how to exhaust every community agency and exploit it for its potential in helping the child to become a good, functioning human being. And here I want to refer briefly to some of my experiences in Flint with the community school. I want to give you, just take a little example, one that I am familiar with, and when I'm through with this, I'm going to stop and you can ask questions or do anything that you feel like doing. There is a school in Flint that I visit every now and then, especially when I feel pretty low about things, because I always come away with more hope and faith. And may I say that don't anybody get the idea here that I am taking a holier than thou attitude, or that I think this is easy, or that I have ready solutions. I don't have any ready solutions. And this is a tough job, and it's hard, and there are days when you feel very discouraged. But I go to visit this school, and somehow I always come away with more hope. One day I was there. There is in this school a wonderful Negro lady by the name of Mrs. Collins. I don't know how she got into the teaching profession. It seems to me she got in by the back door in some way. But when a new family moves into this school neighborhood, she goes out to visit. And she tells me that when she comes in, she often finds this new family has moved in from down in Appalachia somewhere. And she sees the mother standing there washing dishes. And she washes the dishes with an old dirty dish rag. And then she wrings out the old dirty dish rag and wipes the dishes with the same dirty rag. Now you are kind of appalled here by this. You think, well, what a horrible way to wash dishes. And Mrs. Collins says that, of course, she said, my first inclination was to go in and tell this lady, now you shouldn't wash dishes like this. But she said, I realized that if I did that I would get off to a bad start. So she said, instead, I tell her that over at the school every morning we serve breakfast to about 100 children who wouldn't otherwise get any breakfast. And we can do this because we use surplus food, and the mothers come in and help us. And would you come in and help? Now, I want you to notice one thing here. If I go to you and say, will you help me? We're on a much better place than if I go and say, look, I want to help you. You're a poor, benighted person who needs help. If I ask help of you, this means that I respect you and you have something to give. So the mother comes to school, and there she washes dishes with others in a sanitary way, and she learns. And after they're through, and one morning I was there, I've been there many mornings, but on this particular morning, a group of Mrs. Collins sat down with about a dozen of these mothers, and she said, they'd put away the dishes and put away the food, and the children had gone upstairs to the classrooms, and she said, now we have a few minutes here together. What would you like to talk about today? And one mother said, you know, my children are so shabby that they're ashamed to go to school, and I don't know what to do. And my husband is out of work, and I don't know where I'm going to get the money. So Mrs. Collins said, over in the corner there is a big pile of upholstery fabrics. These are the odds and ends from from the Buick factory, the last model run. She said they're materials that make wonderful pants for boys and skirts for girls. But the lady says, I can't sew. She said, along the wall there are 8 sewing machines. You can come in here any time, and I'll help you. They put little slips on the children when they started school. And on the little slip it said, please read to me. And the next day a mother comes to school and says, I can't read. So the teacher says, upstairs we're learning to read together. I cite this because I find so many people. This last year we've had 56 interns with us from all over the United States, and our basic idea is to prepare these people to be school administrators. And when some of these interns first came in and we sent them out to visit, to see these activities going on, they came back and they said, well, you're not doing education, you're doing social work. Schools have no business to do this. You should turn all of this over to the welfare. But we have found that there is no community agency that is in as good a position to look after the child in these areas as the school. The school can reach the church. The school can reach the community agency. The school can reach anybody it wants to. It can mobilize the resources of the community as no agency. It's a continuing agency. It's always there. And you know, the thing that just amazes me, I remember taking a group of very distinguished visitors there one morning, and Charles Taft of Cincinnati was in the group, I remember. And there were about a dozen mothers there that morning, and one after the other, these mothers got up to tell what this school had done for them and their children, and how they how they had a different outlook on life. And I could go on with this all day, and I won't I'll be boring you before I get through. But let me tell you one little incident. About 6-7 years ago, a man retired from Buick. He had had some experience with landscaping. And when he retired from Buick, he began to go around and help his neighbors to improve their yards, planting shrubbery, getting their houses painted up. And this is a neighborhood with a very limited economic. They're workers, but they're lower paid workers. You know, he has been at this now for 6 or 7 years. He's done so well on his street that they have named the street after him. And you should see the street. It's just unbelievable, the transformation that has been wrought. Now this man got interested in this through the school, and the school helped him to make contact with the families and all. So when I take people over there, he comes in and he tells about his experience with these people and what has happened. And then we discover something in the field of education that I don't know why we haven't paid more attention to it. But the biggest single factor in any individual's education is his own self-concept. How does he see himself? What does he think of himself? Now just look what we do in the average school. Here comes this child to school. Say he comes from a very limited background. And by the way, if you haven't had any contact with this, and I don't know how much contact you people have had, but I want to give you one example to show you how limited the contact is. I was in one of these preschool classes the other day, and the teacher said to the children, now these are 4 and 5-year-olds, the teacher said to the children, take your pencil and paper. They just sat there. Finally it dawned on the teacher that they didn't know what a pencil was. And so she held up the pencil. So they took their pencils. And about half of them, I noticed, had the rubber end of the pencil down. Now there are no objects in these homes. Have you ever visited these homes? One of my interns last fall sat across the table from me at a dinner, and he said, in the last 2 months, I have visited 71 homes. And he said, I'll never be the same again. I would strongly urge you to visit these homes if you work in an area that's disadvantaged. Because as what you see in these homes, after you see the home, you will see why these children don't score well on the tests and why they don't get along in reading. But now this child comes to school and the teacher says, you read. Why should he read? What interest has he in reading? What background has he for reading? Nothing. So what do we do at the end of the month? Give him a low mark. And then he takes that home and mother bawls him out and father adds a little, and then he comes back, and we do this every month for years. And finally he can't take it anymore and he drops out of school. I was in a group the other day and speaking to the Democratic women in Lansing. The Republican women didn't ask me, so that's... But anyway, there was about 700 of these women. And I was trying to get them to see this point about the marking system. And I said, if the marking system is so good for children, why shouldn't we use it for adults? For instance, I said it'd be a very good place to start with the wives, you know. You get married, and at the end of the first month, why, your husband gives you a report card. And it's marked failure. And you get this for every month for 10 years. How would you feel about yourself as a wife? Not good. Everybody laughs. This is such a silly idea. Whoever could think of such a silly thing? You don't think it's silly when it's done with the kids, do you? And believe me, the wives could take it a lot better than the kids, because they got defenses that the kids don't have. You know, if you believe in yourself You can do anything. If you don't believe in yourself, if you don't like yourself, if you don't like what you see in the mirror, if you have no faith in yourself, you can't do anything. And if I had any one thing to say to you when you leave this summer and go back to your work, this is what I would say. I would say, be sure that you behave with these children in such a way that every day, when each child goes home, he likes himself better than when he came in the morning. I'll leave it there now, and you can